After the divorce from my wife, Lacey, I had to move into a really crappy apartment. Lacey got to keep the house. I could have fought her more in the divorce, but I always had this thought in the back of my head that one day Lacey and I would get back together. I had just moved into my new place when I got an alert on my phone. It was from the Ring camera app in my old house. It was just footage of Lacey standing on the front porch with her arms full of groceries. I felt like a creep for spying on her. That was her house now, and I shouldn't have access to the Ring camera, especially since she obviously forgot that it was even there. I thought about calling the company and canceling the whole thing, but then I stopped myself. It was an expensive house in a very isolated area. The Ring camera was a necessary security feature. In the end, I decided to keep it installed and watch out for anything suspicious. I also didn't tell Lacey. Looking back, that was a pretty big mistake. One night, I got a notification from the Ring camera. It was 3 in the morning, and Lacey was never out that late. I turned on the live feed and saw a man with tattoos all over his face. He barely looked human with all those tattoos. I watched the video as the man looked straight into the camera and smiled, as if he knew someone was watching. He didn't move for a long time, just staring and smiling. And then finally he gave a little half wave to the camera and walked back into the night. I had to tell Lacey, even if that would mean exposing myself. I called her at about 3:30 in the morning. It took her a while to answer, and when she did, she still sounded half asleep. "I don't want to scare you," I said, "but I just got an alert on the Ring camera. There was a guy with all these face tattoos just outside your front door." I guess my words finally woke her up. "What?" she screamed. "You've been spying on me?" And she hung up the phone. She didn't believe me. I called her the next day, but she didn't answer. Then I called the day after that. Still no answer. Worried, I went back to the house, but it was completely empty. Lacey's car was still in the driveway, but there was no sign that she was there. Even her bed was made. Without any other options, I drove to the police station to report a missing person. The officer wrote down everything I said. I made sure not to leave anything out. Then he called in the police chief and he gave a quick summary of what I just said. The chief looked strangely familiar, but I wasn't sure where I'd seen him from. Then it hit me. He looked exactly like the man outside Lacey's house. He didn't have any of the same tattoos, but his face was the same. He glared at me, and I could tell from his expression that he knew I recognized him. He screamed, "I don't believe this man for a second! Lock him up until he tells us the truth!" The other officer was much younger than his boss, so he kept his head lowered and muttered, "Yes, sir." The police chief hurried off while his officer took me to a holding cell and locked me up. "Sorry," he said, and I could tell he was being genuine. He believed my story even though his boss didn't. I stayed in that cell for hours, losing all hope of saving Lacey. Then, after what felt like forever, the police officer came back and unlocked my cell. "I'm free to go?" I asked. "Not technically," he explained. "I'm going against orders here, but as soon as you mentioned about tattoos, I had my suspicions about the captain. I've seen him when he's off duty, covered in those things as some kind of disguise. And Captain Arnold never treats witnesses the way he's treating you." I was happy to have him on my side, but I didn't know what we were going to do next. Then the officer said, "I know Captain Arnold has a private shed in his yard that no one is allowed to see. If we're going to find your ex-wife, I think that's where we should start." So the officer, whose name was Capaldi, took me out of the station and drove me to Captain Arnold's house. We snuck around the side, careful not to make too much noise, and we reached his shed. We could tell through the cracks that lights were on inside. Officer Capaldi was about to knock, but instead, He threw open the door and ran inside, gun ready. I was right behind him. I couldn't believe what I saw. The shed had been redesigned into a makeshift tattoo parlor. Lacey was tied to a metal slab while the police chief drew horrific tattoos on her entire body, including her face. To make the scene even more disgusting, the captain was wearing those same fake tattoos on his face, making him look more like a witch doctor than a policeman. Lacey screamed through the rag in her mouth. Officer Capaldi stepped closer. "Drop the needle," he ordered. But the captain wasn't using a tattoo needle. He was using what looked like a Sharpie marker. That gave me a little bit of relief. Whatever weird tattoo thing this man had, at least it wasn't permanent. Just very, very weird. Slowly, the captain dropped the marker and raised his hands. He stepped toward us, acting like he was giving up. That was only an act. When he got close enough to Officer Capaldi, he wrestled the gun out of his hand and shoved him to the ground. Then he ran away. I ran over to Lacey and untied her from the slab. "It hurts! It hurts!" she kept repeating, as if the Sharpie marker was eating into her, like acid. Rather than go back to the police station, Officer Capaldi took us straight to the hospital. The doctors treated Lacey as best they could, but in the end, they couldn't wash off any of the markings. Whatever special marker he was using, it wasn't just ink. It was permanent. It's been a while since this all went down. Lacey's out of the hospital. She wants to get back together, but now, I'm not so sure. On the one hand, I'll always love my wife, but on the other, I can't stand to look at her anymore.
Last September, my husband Joe bought himself a motorcycle. It was definitely a midlife crisis decision. He had just turned 60. I begged him not to. I literally showed him motorcycle accident videos on my phone, but he wouldn't hear me out. I eventually made him a promise that if he always wore his helmet, which wasn't required in our state, that I would do the best that I would do to accept it. Thankfully, he didn't go for long rides, just a couple hours at a time. But whenever he was gone, I turned into a nervous wreck. Joe was the sweetest, most genuine person you ever met, and I was terrified of losing him. One evening, he went for a ride before dinner. It started raining about 20 minutes after he left. Very soon, the rain turned into a full-on monsoon. I could see the trees shaking wildly through the windows. Joe had never driven his motorcycle in bad weather before, so I prayed that he came back right away. After an hour, he wasn't back. I didn't know at the time, but Joe actually tried to return home. He was 2 minutes away from our house when he skidded over a pothole and lost control of his bike. He was passing the local cemetery at the time. His front tire jammed into the pothole, and his body was thrown into the air and over the cemetery wall. He slammed against the headstone and passed out. A passing driver called 911, and Joe was taken to the hospital. A nurse called me and told me to come immediately. When I got there, Joe was lying in his bed. Doctors told me that he was extremely lucky. He had sprained his wrist and cracked 2 ribs, but otherwise unharmed. They did all the brain scan stuff and couldn't find any signs of a concussion. I cried in relief. The doctor left the room, and I asked Joe how he was feeling. "I could use a cigarette," he muttered. Joe hadn't smoked since he was a teenager, and I wasn't about to let him restart. I told him no, and he threw a bedpan at me. That was very unlike him. I ran out of the room and pulled the doctor aside. "Doctor, are you sure he doesn't have any brain trauma?" He told me that they triple-checked everything. I described Joe's sudden change in personality, and the doctor said that outbursts were normal after an accident. I didn't have anything to worry about. I didn't believe him, though. Joe stayed at the hospital overnight. I was planning to sleep on the chair in his room, but he ordered me to leave. The next morning, I went back to pick him up, and he was still in a foul mood. The only time he talked on a long drive back home was when we were passing the cemetery. He pointed out where the accident had happened. I saw the headstone that he struck was cracked in two. After that, he didn't say anything. For the next 5 days, I tried to take care of Joe at home. I brought him his meals in bed and made sure that he walked enough each day. The whole time, he was openly rude to me. Foods that he used to like suddenly tasted horrible. He didn't even want to sleep in the same bed as me, so I moved into the guest room. There were other changes too. He kept demanding cigarettes until I had to drive to the store. Very soon, our bedroom reeked of smoke. He started using different words. He asked for a pop, even though he always said soda. He sneezed when our cat was around, even though he never had allergies before. And strangest of all, he started calling me Gloria, which wasn't my name at all. At first, I thought it was a joke, but no. He genuinely thought my name was Gloria. I corrected him the first few times, but after a while I started answering to it. Eventually I had enough. He never acted like this before. Something happened to his brain during the crash. I told Joe that I was taking him back to the hospital. That was a statement, and I wasn't backing down. Slowly he pushed himself out of bed and limped towards me. I thought he was finally listening to reason until he grabbed my shoulders. "I'm not going back there, Gloria," he yelled in my face. Then he pushed me against the wall. His face was twisted into pure hatred. I ran. Joe chased me out the room and into the hall. I screamed the whole time. He carried his lunch tray with him, wielding it like a weapon. I tried to dive into the bathroom and lock the door behind me, but he was too fast. He yanked me back into the hallway and dragged me toward the balcony. I tried to pull free, but he whacked me with the tray. Once we were on the balcony, he closed the door behind us and let me go. He casually tossed the tray over the edge and watched it fall. "Jump with me, Gloria." Our house was 2 stories tall, but our balcony looked pretty steep over the ravine. If we jumped, we would most likely die. He held out his hand as an invitation. "Please." I pretended to reach for his hand, and then I pushed him out of the way and ran back inside. I locked the balcony door. He pounded on the glass, but I wouldn't let him in. Then he just stopped and sat on the ledge staring at me, seemingly giving up. I ran into the other room and grabbed my phone, but when I came back, the balcony was empty. I opened the door and looked down into the ravine, but I couldn't see his body. Did he climb down the wall? Was that even possible? I went downstairs and looked all around the house, but he was gone. I got into my car and drove around the neighborhood looking for him. It was the middle of the night, and I didn't see anything in our dark street. I was too afraid to go back home, so I decided to keep driving and go to the police station for help. On my way, I passed the cemetery. I saw the still broken headstone, but this time, there was an old woman standing in front of it. I don't know why, but something compelled me to stop the car and talk with her. I parked a few feet away and joined her in the cemetery. The name broken on the headstone was Joseph, just like my husband. I introduced myself to the woman and asked her why she was here. "I heard my ex-husband's grave was defaced. I had to see it for myself," she said. "I'm so sorry about that." "Don't be," she explained. "I'm glad it's broken." She said that her dead husband was violent, a chain-smoking psychopath. He spent the last 3 years of his life in a hospital for the criminally insane. He was a terrible person. I told him I would never be putting my name next to his. I asked her what her name was. She turned to me, looked me dead in my eyes, and told me her name was Gloria. As Gloria talked, all I could think about was my Joe. This woman's dead husband sounded exactly what my husband was going through, how he acted. Had the spirit of this man possessed Joe? That would explain all his changes. Then again, so would a concussion. Eventually, I told myself that I was reading too much into things. Ghosts weren't real. Dead people couldn't possess you. It was all a weird coincidence. The woman asked me why I'd come, and I told her for no reason. Then I waved to her and left. To this day, my husband is still missing. The police searched the area around my house, including the ravine, but they couldn't find him. I don't expect to ever see Joe again. But if you do, I don't think it's him anymore.
I clicked on the lights in my office and sat down with a grumbled sigh, still half asleep. It was barely past 7 o'clock in the morning, but I'd had an urgent email come through from a potential client and I had to drag myself to work to check it out. As a private investigator on the higher end of the scale, it was only expected of me to be on call at all times, even this early in the morning. I checked the email while I waited for the coffee machine to kick in, scanning my eyes several times over the text until I had all the details. Rich family, missing kid. That was the general gist of it. Though the family name made me do a double take. The Reynolds. Everyone knew the Reynolds for their lavish lifestyle and perfect family. They were a pillar of the community. Although they exuded wealth, they did their part to donate to charity and uphold a likable public image. It was the youngest son and heir to their massive wealth who had gone missing, a young man by the name of Jason Reynolds. As far as I recalled from seeing him in the media, he was the family's golden child, the smart and successful one who had practically usurped all of his older siblings as the favorite. After I accepted the job and received my initial payment, I kicked off the preliminary investigation into Jason's disappearance. The first point of call was to track his last known whereabouts and liaisons, and determine who had seen him last and where. From there, I could start to build a picture of what might have happened in the time afterwards. I spent the next few days interviewing everyone who was part of his personal life, from his parents to his siblings to the serving and cleaning staff that resided in their family home. They all said a similar thing. Nobody had seen Jason since he left the house alone late one Friday evening. He hadn't told anyone where he was going, and he had hired a cab instead of taking their private chauffeur. It was Jason's mother, Julia, who caught my interest the most. She answered all my questions in a similar manner to the others, but as we were leaving, she looked as though she was about to say something else. "Is there something on your mind?" I prompted when she hesitated, her gaze flicking up to meet mine before darting away again. Definitely a sign that she was hiding something. No, it's fine. Please, just find my son," was all she said before flicking her wrist for one of the staff members to show me out. I watched her go, curiously, and then I made a mental note of it before leaving. Whatever she was hiding, it would come to light eventually. That was my job, after all, discovering all the secrets that people wanted to keep hidden. With the interviews not giving me much to go on, I instead turned my focus to figuring out where the cab had taken him on Friday evening. There was a reason he hadn't taken the family's driver. He didn't want anyone to know where he was going. According to his older sister, she'd seen him climb into a cab from a local company who had an office not too far away from my own. Since it was my only lead for the moment, I decided to pursue it and paid a visit to the cab company's headquarters. "Excuse me, does anyone recognize this young man?" I asked, showing the picture of Jason to the drivers. One of them spoke up from the back after studying the picture closely. "Yeah, I know him. Took him someplace downtown on Friday night. I remember because he tipped real well." That sounded like Jason. "Do you remember the name of the place you dropped him off?" The man nodded and scribbled something down on a piece of paper. An address. "Thanks, you've been a great help," I told him before climbing back into my car and heading to the location that the driver had taken him. The address ended up belonging to a shady-looking bar in the downtown area of the city. Judging by the folks hanging around the street corners, it definitely wasn't somewhere the son of a rich family should be visiting on a Friday night. What had he been doing all the way out here? It was looking to me like perhaps he was involved in business he shouldn't be. Business that would definitely ruin his and his family's reputation if it were to go public. The Reynolds' golden boy wasn't perhaps as charming and innocent as he had everyone believing. I spoke to the people inside the club and followed the further clues they provided, until I came across a name of interest. Peter Lotz. According to one of the witnesses, they had seen Peter confront Jason outside the bar before the two of them had left together. With this information, I finally had a key suspect in Jason's disappearance. While searching for Peter's whereabouts, I did some digging into his life to see if he had any connection to Jason that I could use to fuel the investigation. According to some obscure articles I found online, Peter had lost his daughter some months ago. Now, while some sources posited it as an accident, there were others that were ruling foul play, specifically murder. And by then, I was starting to formulate a potential series of events that had led to Jason's disappearance. If he was involved in some dangerous business, well, then murder wouldn't be too far off that list either. Was that what his mother had been hiding? Had she known that her son was somehow involved with dangerous people? Had she known what he'd done? By the time we tracked Peter down, it was already too late. We found Jason's body in the basement, his corpse cold and bloody. "He deserved it," Peter kept muttering once the police came to arrest him. "He deserved it. He had it coming. He deserved it. He deserved it all." Later, after managing to get a coherent statement from Peter, he told us he had kidnapped and killed Jason in retaliation for Jason murdering his daughter in a drug deal gone wrong. Jason's mother had paid him a large sum of money to keep quiet about the fact, but the guilt and lack of justice had driven him to take things into his own hands. In the end, it was Jason's own actions and his mother's attempts to hush it up that had gotten him killed.
My assistant Rhonda was a complete idiot. I tried to cut her some slack, but she kept forgetting to tell me about important meetings, and whenever I needed her for something, she was off for a smoke break. I wanted to fire her so badly, but she was my boss's niece. One day, she messed up yet again my lunch order, and I was furious. I think it was mostly the hunger talking, but I snapped at Rhonda for the first time. "I'm so sorry," she said, on the verge of tears. "I forgot you were allergic. You know, there's a McDonald's down the street if you're really hungry." I quickly rushed out of the building before I said anything that I would regret. Rhonda was very close to her uncle, and I didn't want to tell him that she was a very difficult employee. I drove straight to McDonald's. Not my favorite, but it was fast. After I ordered, I noticed my coworker Nick was eating in the corner. He worked in accounting, and I had a little crush on him for a couple months now. He wasn't the hardest worker, from what I heard, but God was he handsome. I was surprised a guy with his physique would ever eat McDonald's. He waved over at me, and so I sat with him. I never talked to him outside of work before, but we started vibing right away. We ended up sitting together for an extra 30 minutes just because we were so lost in conversation. Then he looked down at his watch and said that he had to hurry back to work. I did too. We got in our separate cars and drove back to the office. I felt like I was on cloud 9, until I remembered that I was late. I didn't have any meetings yet, but I didn't trust Rhonda to handle things without me. I rushed back to my department, and Rhonda greeted me at her desk. To my surprise, I didn't miss anything. Nothing bad happened in my absence. I had taken some personal time to myself, and the world didn't collapse. Rhonda apparently was thinking the same thing because she said, "You know, you always work through your lunches. You should go off-site more often. A lot of people do. That hot guy in accounting goes to McDonald's almost every day." That was a very persuasive argument. If I went to McDonald's, I'd get to see Nick again. I was too busy to go every day, but I could go once a week, Wednesdays. And every time I went, Nick was there. Sometimes he'd be there first, sometimes I would. We'd always order separately and then sit together. They weren't dates per se, even though I really, really liked him. And I think he liked me too. We had real connections, but I was too afraid to make the first move. Over the next few weeks, our Wednesday lunch dates got longer and longer. But whenever I went back to the office, Rhonda always had everything under control. Still, she made some mistakes, but she was getting better. I even decided to give her some responsibilities to see if she could handle it. Data entry mostly. When I was gone, she was in charge for filing separate spreadsheets on my computer. One morning, I saw Nick walking through the department. I actually hadn't seen him in the office since we started having our lunches together. He was always so busy. Right away, I knew that he was coming to see me. Our connection was too strong to be confined to a fast food restaurant. My heart raced. But then Nick approached Rhonda, and the two of them ducked quietly into a supply closet. He didn't even realize that I had seen him. Obviously, I pushed my ear against the door to hear what was going on. They were talking about me. I couldn't hear all the words, but I heard my name a couple of times, and the words 23,000. I looked around. The rest of the office was empty. Everyone was off at some meeting. I dragged a chair to the closet door and wedged against the handle, trapping them both inside. I didn't say anything. I kept listening, and slowly, I was able to figure out their plan. Rhonda and Nick were a couple. That was pretty clear. They were also working together to steal from me. Nick would keep me at McDonald's for as long as they needed, while Rhonda used my personal computer to rewire money from my bank accounts. She took small amounts each week, but over time, she managed to accumulate $23,000. Furious, I ran back to my desk and opened my bank account. Sure enough, money had been transferred into some foreign account. It happened like clockwork, every Wednesday at lunch. I felt like such a moron. I should have figured this out sooner, but I guess I was so distracted by Nick. He really fooled me. I called the police, and they charged back to the supply closet. Rhonda and Nick had already realized that they were trapped in the closet. They screamed and pounded on the door. "Who's in there?" I asked. They both went quiet. "You locked us in, huh?" Rhonda asked through the door. "Yep." "You know about the money?" Rhonda asked. "I know everything," I said. "Except the reason why. I won't let you out until you tell me." She didn't. That's probably the most frustrating part of this whole story. He had such a whiny voice when he apologized, and he tried to blame everything on Rhonda. Then Rhonda tried to shift the blame back to me. As they were explaining their many crimes, the police arrived. They stood with me and listened to the confessions on the other side of the door. Our boss, Rhonda's uncle, came with the police. He looked livid. He kicked the chair away, flung open the door, and let the cops take them both away. Since then, I got all my money back. I also got a promotion. I'm not sure what happened to Nick and Rhonda, but they don't work here anymore.